Claire wasn't expecting anyone that night. The street outside was still, the kind of quiet that makes every sound in the house louder. She had just set down her book when a knock echoed softly against her door. It wasn't urgent, not heavy, but it startled her all the same. For a second, she froze, unsure if she'd imagined it. But then it came again, gentle, deliberate. She walked slowly to the door, her mind already racing through possibilities. Maybe a lost driver, or maybe a lost driver, or maybe trouble. But when she pulled the door open, it wasn't any of those things. It was Daniel, her neighbor from across the street. He stood there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his dark hair falling a little messily over his forehead. He gave a faint smile, but it looked tired, as though the day had pressed too hard against him. Claire blinked in surprise. They weren't strangers, but they weren't close either. Friendly waves. Short chats in the driveway, the occasional borrowed tool or package picked up. Nothing more. She hadn't seen him on her doorstep before, and certainly not this late. "Hi," he said, his voice calm, almost cautious. "Sorry for showing up like this." I was hoping. He hesitated, as though unsure if he should even continue. "I was hoping I could borrow some coffee. I ran out, and I didn't want to drive all the way out tonight." The request was simple. It's almost ordinary, but something about the way he asked made Claire pause. Maybe it was the way his eyes held hers, searching for permission, or the quiet weight in his tone. She found herself stepping back, opening the door wider without much thought. "Of course. Come in." Daniel stepped inside, careful, almost too polite. His presence shifted the air in the small house. Claire walked quickly to the kitchen, pulling down the tin of coffee grounds she always kept stocked. She could have just handed it to him and sent him back with a wave, but something in her wanted him to stay. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been pressing on her lately, the silence of evenings that dragged too long. Or maybe it was the way he seemed to carry his own silence with him, as though hers might understand it. "Thank you," he said as she handed him the jar. His fingers brushed against hers for only a second, and she felt the brief contact linger longer than it should have. He looked at the tin, then back at her, almost hesitant. "Would you mind if I stayed for a cup? Just one." The question surprised her, but she nodded before she could even think it through. "Sure," she said quickly, moving to fill the kettle. The click of the switch broke the quiet, and soon the soft hum of heating water filled the space between them. Daniel took a seat at the small kitchen table, glancing around as though he wasn't sure he belonged there. Claire turned, leaning against the counter as she studied him. He wasn't dressed for visiting, just jeans and a worn jacket, the kind of clothes someone pulls on without care. His shoulders sloped a little, not from bad posture, but from the kind of tiredness that went deeper than a long day. He caught her looking, and for a second their eyes locked. She looked away quickly, busying herself with mugs. When the coffee was ready, she placed the steaming cups on the table and sat across from him. Neither of them spoke right away. The quiet stretched, not awkward, but filled with something unspoken. Claire wrapped her hands around the warm mug, the heat seeping into her palms. Daniel finally broke the silence with a small sigh. "Sorry if this is strange," he said softly. "I just didn't want to sit in my kitchen tonight staring at the walls." His words struck her. She knew exactly what he meant. Nights had a way of growing heavier when you were alone. When the world outside had gone still, and all you had left were thoughts you didn't ask for. She nodded, her throat tight, though she didn't explain why. She didn't need to. Daniel smiled faintly, grateful for her quiet understanding. He leaned back, relaxing a little, as though her acceptance made him lighter. The tension that had walked in with him seemed to ease, even if only by a thread. For the first time in weeks, Claire realized she didn't mind the interruption of her routine. The knock on her door had broken the silence in a way she hadn't known she needed. The minutes passed. And though their words were few, the visit carried a kind of comfort neither of them expected. A simple request for coffee had turned into something else, something subtle but stirring. Claire found herself wondering as she watched him sip slowly from the mug. Why the sight of him sitting at her table felt like it belonged there, and as the night stretched on, she felt a shift within her. A quiet knock, a tired smile, and an unexpected visit from the neighbor had unsettled the stillness of her life. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew one thing. This night wasn't one she would forget. Claire and Daniel sat across from each other at the kitchen table, steam rising between them like a quiet curtain. At first, the talk was light, almost nervous, the kind of words people reach for when they don't yet know what else to say. He asked about her garden, about the flowers that always seemed to bloom earlier on her side of the street. She smiled, explaining how she had planted them years ago, back when she believed her life would be fuller, noisier, filled with people to share them with. Daniel listened closely, nodding, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to show he was grateful for the small story. She asked about his work, remembering he managed a small construction team. He told her about the hours, the travel, the constant fixing of problems that weren't his fault. His voice carried the rhythm of someone used to explaining without complaining, but she could hear the weariness underneath. She didn't press, just let him talk. The cups grew lighter, the coffee cooling, but neither seemed eager to finish. Slowly, the conversation shifted. Claire shared how quiet her house had become since her daughter left for college. She admitted she still set an extra place at the table sometimes, out of habit, though she usually ended up eating alone. She tried to laugh as she said it, but the sound cracked. Daniel didn't laugh with her, he didn't need to. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes steady, the silence holding more weight than any words could. When he spoke again, his tone had softened. "It's strange," he said, his gaze dropping to the rim of his mug. "How a house can feel so full of life one moment, and then almost overnight, it's just walls and furniture." He paused, and for a breath Claire thought he might leave it there. But then he added, "Since the divorce, evenings feel endless. The TV doesn't tea help. Music doesn't help. It just makes me realize how much space there is." The confession wasn't dramatic, but it carried a truth that made Claire's chest tighten. She didn't interrupt. She let the words settle, because she knew what it felt like when someone finally admitted something they'd been carrying alone. She said quietly, "I know what you mean." Her hands traced the curve of her mug as she spoke. "I thought I'd gotten used to the silence, but some nights it feels heavier than others. Some nights I almost wish someone would knock on the door, just so I wouldn't have to sit with it." Her voice wavered as she realized what she had just confessed. It was the kind of sentence she never spoke aloud, the kind that belonged in the privacy of her thoughts. But Daniel didn't look at her with pity. His expression softened into something else, understanding. For a while, neither said anything. The hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen, and the clock ticked steadily on the wall. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was alive, charged. As though each of them was waiting for the other to say something, neither dared to voice. Daniel finally broke it. "It feels easier talking to you than I expected," he admitted, almost as though he was surprised by himself. "I didn't think I'd say any of this out loud, but sitting here, it doesn't feel so heavy." Claire's heart thudded. She tried to respond, but the words stuck. She wanted to tell him she felt the same, that she hadn't realized how much she craved this conversation that went deeper than weather reports and polite waves. But she couldn't bring herself to say it. Instead, she just nodded, her throat too tight. He smiled faintly at her silence, as if he understood what she couldn't say. He shifted in his chair, leaning back, and his eyes found hers again. This time she held the gaze for longer, until her pulse forced her to look down. She reached for her mug, though it was nearly empty, just to have something to do with her hands. The clock struck midnight, but neither of them moved. The world outside was asleep, the neighborhood still, yet inside that small kitchen, it felt like time had slowed, making space for something new to grow. Daniel tapped the side of his cup absent-mindedly. "I didn't realize how late it was," he murmured. But he didn't stand up. Claire gave a soft laugh, though her chest tightened. "Me neither." There was a moment, brief but sharp, when she thought he might say something that would change the air between them entirely. He leaned forward slightly, his hand brushing close to hers on the table, close enough for her to feel the warmth. He hesitated, his lips parting as if to confess something. But then he stopped, pulling back, his jaw tightening. Whatever he had almost said stayed locked inside. Instead, he sighed. I should probably let you rest. You've been kind enough to let me sit here all night. Her heart sank at his words, though she tried not to show it. She wanted to ask him to stay a little longer, to admit she wasn't ready for the night to end, but she swallowed it down. She only managed, I didn't mind. Their eyes met again, and this time the silence between them felt fragile, like glass balanced on the edge of breaking. It carried the weight of everything they hadn't said, everything they had only hinted at. Daniel rose slowly, sliding the empty mug toward her. He stood by the door for a moment, his hand resting on the frame, his body angled as if he might step back inside. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For the coffee and for listening." His eyes lingered on her face, almost searching, before he finally turned to go. When the door closed, Claire stayed at the table, staring at the empty space where he had been sitting. The warmth of the conversation clung to her, but so did the ache of unfinished words. She leaned back in her chair, pressing her hands against her chest, her heart still racing. It had been just a simple visit, just a shared cup of coffee. Yet the conversation had opened something inside her she hadn't touched in years. And as the night slipped further into silence, she realized she would carry his words with her long after the clock struck midnight. Daniel stayed longer than he had planned. The clock had already passed midnight, yet the pull of conversation and the quiet warmth of Claire's kitchen made it hard for him to leave. Claire noticed it too, the way he lingered over his empty cup, the way his shoulders seemed less heavy than when he first knocked on her door. She could sense there was something unsaid, something hovering on his lips, and though she tried to ignore it, she couldn't stop her heart from beating faster. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the table as though gathering courage. When he spoke, his voice was lower, softer, almost uncertain. "It feels easier talking to you than anyone else," he said. The words came out like a secret he hadn't meant to share. And once they were spoken, the room changed. Claire's chest tightened. She wanted to say she felt the same, but the words caught in her throat. She pressed her palms against the mug, though it was cold now, trying to steady herself. His admission wasn't romantic, not directly, but it carried weight. It was personal, vulnerable, and in the quiet of the night. It struck her more deeply than she expected. She lifted her eyes, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. The silence grew heavy, not uncomfortable, but charged with meaning. His gaze didn't waver, and she felt exposed, as though he could see the loneliness she carried but never admitted. She looked away quickly, afraid she might give herself away. Daniel shifted in his chair, running a hand through his hair, his nerves showing. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he muttered. "Maybe because I've been holding it in too long. People ask how I'm doing, and I always say, I'm fine. But sitting here with you, I don't feel like I need to pretend." His honesty left Claire breathless. She wasn't used to people opening up to her anymore. Most days, conversations with neighbors or coworkers stayed on the surface, polite, distant, safe. But here he was, sitting in her kitchen, unraveling pieces of his heart without asking for anything in return. She felt a rush of warmth, mixed with fear. She wanted to tell him she understood, that she too wore the mask of "I'm fine" far too often, that she too dreaded the silence of her own house. But instead of words, she gave a small nod, her eyes shining though she tried to blink it away. The moment stretched, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hand brushing close to hers on the table. It wasn't a touch, not yet, but the closeness was enough to make her pulse race. She wondered if he knew, if he could feel the air shift between them. Claire swallowed hard, forcing her voice to steady. "I'm glad you came over tonight," she said. Her tone was simple, but her heart pounded with the weight of it. Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile, one that looked more real than the tired smile he wore when he first arrived. He seemed about to say something, his mouth opening as though words were ready to spill. But then he stopped. His eyes flickered with hesitation, and whatever thought had come to him stayed locked inside. Instead, he exhaled slowly, leaning back again. "You've been kind," he said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't expect to stay this long." I should probably let you sleep. The words stung, though she tried not to show it. She wanted to say she didn't mind, that she wanted him to stay longer. That the silence after he left would feel heavier than before. But she only managed a small smile. It's fine, she whispered. I don't mind. He stood slowly, sliding his empty mug toward her, his fingers brushing the table. The kitchen suddenly felt colder as he stepped away, as though the warmth of his presence was already fading. Claire rose too, following him to the door, her steps slower than usual. At the doorway, he paused. His hand rested on the frame, and for a moment, he didn't move. His eyes found hers again, holding them with an intensity that made her breath catch. It was as though he wanted to say something, something that would change everything. But the words stayed trapped. Thank you, he said finally, his voice low, almost rough. For the coffee. For listening. For being here. His gaze lingered on her face, softer than before. As though memorizing her in that moment. Claire's throat tightened, but she managed a quiet reply. Any time the space between them felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. For one heartbeat, she thought he might step closer, that he might bridge the distance. But then, just as quickly, he opened the door, letting the cool night air slip inside. Good night. Claire, he said. Good night, Daniel, she whispered back, and then he was gone. The door closed with a gentle click, leaving her in the stillness of her house once more. She stood there for a moment, her hand still on the doorknob, her heart racing. The kitchen behind her felt too quiet, too empty, as though the conversation that had filled it just minutes ago had been a dream. She turned back, staring at the empty chair where he had sat, her chest aching with a mix of warmth and longing. She knew something had shifted tonight. It wasn't just coffee. It wasn't just small talk. Daniel had let her see a side of him no one else did, and in doing so, he had touched something inside her she thought she had buried long ago. As she walked back to the table, she sat in her chair again, tracing her fingers along the rim of her mug. The night felt endless, yet she couldn't bring herself to go to bed. She replayed every word, every look, every silence. She wondered what he had almost said. The thought that had hovered on his lips but never crossed them. She leaned back, closing her eyes. The house was silent, but her mind was restless. A simple visit had turned into something more, something that left her unsettled yet alive. And though the night stretched on, she knew she wouldn't sleep. Claire had no answers, only questions. Why did his words linger so heavily in her chest? Why did his gaze feel like it saw through the walls she had built? And most of all, what would happen the next time their paths crossed? As the clock ticked past 1, she remained at the table, caught in the echo of a moment that had slipped away too soon, wondering if it had been the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Claire sat in silence long after Daniel left, the sound of the door clicking shut echoing in her mind. The kitchen felt colder without him, the chair across from her glaringly empty. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the untouched coffee in her cup. The steam had faded, leaving only a bitter chill. It wasn't just the coffee that had grown cold, it was the night around her. Pressing in, heavy with questions, she leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes, replaying every word. The way he had thanked her, the way his gaze had lingered, the way he seemed to almost say something more before pulling away. It wasn't nothing. She knew that. There had been something in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Yet he had left, leaving her with fragments of a moment that might have been. Claire stood restless, pacing the kitchen. Her footsteps were soft on the tile, but inside her the noise was deafening. She pressed her palms against the counter, staring out the small window into the dark street. His house sat across the way, the lights inside already off. It looked quiet, ordinary, but tonight she saw it differently. Behind those walls was a man who carried the same weight she did: loneliness, silence, the ache of what once was. And for a fleeting hour, they had shared that weight together. She turned away from the window and walked slowly into the living room. The house felt larger than ever, the walls stretching farther, the shadows growing deeper. She sat on the couch, hugging a pillow against her chest, as though it could fill the space Daniel's presence had left. The clock on the wall ticked louder in the stillness. Every second reminded her that he wasn't there anymore. Her mind refused to quiet. She thought about his words. "It feels easier talking to you than anyone else." She wondered if he regretted saying it, if he had gone home wishing he'd stayed silent. But then she remembered the way he looked at her, steady and soft, as though speaking those words had lifted something from his shoulders. She couldn't imagine him regretting it not when his eyes had carried such relief. Claire pressed her forehead against the pillow, torn between hope and fear. Hope, because tonight had felt like the start of something new. Fear, because she knew how fragile beginnings could be. What if this was nothing more than a moment caught in loneliness? What if tomorrow he would wave from across the street as though nothing had happened? The thought made her chest ache. She wanted to believe it meant more. She wanted to believe that the quiet visit, the coffee, the conversation had been as important to him as it was to her. But doubt was cruel, whispering that maybe she was reading too much into it. She stood again, restless, and wandered through the house. Every room carried memories of her solitude, books stacked neatly on the shelves. A single glass by the sink framed photos of her daughter smiling at milestones far away. She touched the frames gently, wondering what her daughter would say if she knew her mother was sitting up all night thinking about the neighbor. Would she laugh? Would she worry? Claire didn't know. Back in the kitchen, she sat again, staring at the empty chair. It was ridiculous, she thought, to feel this much after just one visit. Yet the feeling was there, strong and insistent. She couldn't push it away, and maybe she didn't want to. For the first time in a long while, her heart felt awake, alive. Beating for more than just routine, she poured herself another cup of coffee, though she didn't drink it. She only held it, warming her hands, letting the simple act give her comfort. She imagined Daniel sitting across from her again, imagined the way his voice filled the silence, imagined what he might have said if he hadn't stopped himself at the door. The thought made her smile, soft and unsteady. Hours slipped by, the night stretching on, but sleep never came. Instead, her mind spun with questions. Would he knock on her door again? Would he act as though nothing had changed? Or would there be another conversation, deeper this time, where the words they hadn't said tonight might finally find their way out? The sky outside slowly lightened, streaks of gray breaking the darkness. Dawn crept in quietly, painting the world in softer tones. Claire sat by the window, watching the neighborhood stir awake. She saw his house again, still quiet, still closed, but it looked different now. It wasn't just the neighbor's house, it was his. Daniel's a man who had knocked on her door when the silence was too heavy. A man who had sat across from her and confessed the truth of his loneliness as the first birds began to sing. Claire realized she had stayed awake the entire night. Yet she didn't feel tired. Her body was restless, her heart still carrying the weight of his presence. She leaned her head against the glass, the cool surface grounding her, and whispered to herself, "What happens now?" She didn't have the answer. But she knew one thing, something had shifted. The night wasn't just a passing moment to forget, had left a mark on her, a quiet echo that refused to fade. Whether it grew into something more or stayed only as a memory, she couldn't say. But she felt it deeply, and that was enough to keep her awake. Enough to remind her that she was still capable of feeling, still capable of wanting more. When the sun finally broke over the rooftops, Claire pulled the curtains closed, shutting out the light. She needed rest, but she knew even as she lay down that sleep would not come easily. Not when her mind was full of his voice, his smile, his almost confession at the door. And so she closed her eyes, holding on to the memory of his visit, knowing it would follow her into the day, into the next evening, into every quiet moment until they crossed paths again. The night had been simple, ordinary on the surface, yet beneath it, something had stirred that she could not ignore. A quiet visit from the neighbor had left her thinking all night. And though morning had arrived, the questions and the hope remained, whispering promises she dared not name.